Good afternoon and welcome to the 12th edition of Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International Lit Fest 2021, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. Coming up now is the session A Sutra-dhar Speaks, the joys of writing historical fiction. Now I'm sure you will agree that fiction uncovers human truths about behavior. The rules of fiction use the imagination and often capture the humanity of the people, while history or non-fiction only captures just the events or the results. And somehow, cold hard facts don't warm us to a story now, do they? To converse on the topic is an author whose previous book, Jalaldinus, A Mask, featured a great king, Akbar. That verse novel, which played with form and style, explored a once great city too, Fatehpur Sikri. And now he has written a fictional memoir of one of India's most storied royal figures, the Emperor Ashoka. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite author Irwin Allan Sealy. Joining him in the conversation is author, teacher of English, and children's playwright Rashmi Palkhivala. Without further ado, let the session begin. Over to you, Rashmi Palkhivala.
Hi, Mr. Seeley. Welcome. It's so lovely to have you step out of the pages of this wonderful book onto our screens. As you can see, I have completely digested it from the number of post-its that I have stuck all over. So just wanted to start with asking you, India has a plethora of kings of all sizes, shapes, dimensions, temperaments. What made you choose Ashoka?
I think because Asoca is so familiar to us, we're in danger of thinking that we know him. And for that reason alone, I think he's worth a second look. And that's exactly what I did myself. And I found I learned a hell of a lot.
Okay, so I found it interesting that in your previous book, The Lalziness, you have a slightly deprecatory passage about Asoka, and he says, sort of chides him for misappropriating his appellation, and says, Ashoka the Great? Don't make me laugh. Graffiti artist painted 6 trees by the roadside, dug a water tank or two, and said, love one another, or was that the other guy? So what was the journey that took you from there to Asoka?
Well, I had no idea that at that point that I would be venturing on Ashoka's turf, and I suppose if I had, I might have chosen my words more carefully. But at that point, he's the butt of a joke, and the beneficiary of the joke, of course, is Akbar himself. But Akbar is also the butt in a way, because the reader is laughing at both of them. And what happened, I suppose, after that? That journey was a journey to Fatehpur Sikri. In fact, I made it 7 times. This next book, the Ashoka book, I suppose goes back to a visit that I made to the great Ashokan rock, which actually exists in our very own district of Dehradun. And I was a little ashamed that I had lived in the city for so long and not actually gone there. And so in a way, this book is kind of expiation for that. But in fact, even before I went there, even before I saw the rock itself, I'd seen many years before one of those black and white grainy photographs of the ASI monument that the British built about 100 years ago over the rock. And that in itself was a mystery to me, and that just kept calling and calling, and I didn't answer. And then finally we did get there, and that was for me a holy moment, because of course this is it's secular history, it's a rock, but that is in a way our Rosetta Stone. We actually owe the strict chronology of Indian history to that stone. And what it is is the clue in there was that Akbar had mentioned 5 foreign kings in that particular inscription. And it was only because scholars knew the dates of those kings in the West, that is to say in Syria and Egypt and so forth. It was through that that Ashoka came to be dated. And from that anchor, we could date other things before or after. So it's a very important rock. It's like a national monument, and I feel that people should actually make a pilgrimage there. Citizens should make a pilgrimage.
Lovely. So many of the facts in Ashoka's life are disputed. So on what basis did you decide which facts to include, what were not relevant? And since you were constructing this literary Ashoka, how did you approach these disputed historical details?
Just as a novelist, really. A novelist is free to pick and choose. And that was my prerogative and nobody else's. So, in fact, that was the first step, is to name your character. For example, in the Akbar book, I called him not Akbar, but Zelaldinus. Now, Zelaldinus was actually the Latin name for Akbar that was given by the Jesuits at his court. And they were writing letters to Rome, reporting, basically. They were out to convert him. And they called him by his name, Jalaluddin. Now, Jalaluddin, Latinized, is Zelaldinus. Now, in the same way, as soon as I called Ashoka Asoca, he became my king. And I was free to do anything I wished with him. So I can take any liberty I want, or I could then, as I was writing it, and be on safe ground.
So what then did the name Asoca represent to you? So what facet are you presenting by calling him Asoca and not Ashoka?
Ashoka is the emperor, the king, the figurehead. Asoka is the man.
Okay.
That is the difference.
Yes. So you also made the deliberate choice of adding the word sutra to the title, which to some people gives it a spiritual tinge. But there's the American academic John Strong, who feels that all of Ashoka's messages are essentially propaganda, and it's a message from a politician who's trying to present himself and his rule, his administration, in the most favorable way. So,
in the first
what
place,
aspect were you trying to present by adding the word sutra or sutra to the title?
a sutra is not necessarily a spiritual or a religious text. The classic case is the Kama Sutra, right? In fact, sutras were essentially just manuals. They were designed to teach you some art or other. So you could have a sutra for grammar, right? So these are all secular things. These are not, they're not religious. So by using or attaching that term to my title as a subtitle, I was actually making a different sort of gesture. I was looking at the formal properties of the sutra, which is basically that it tells a story, or it tells its tale. Even though it's not fiction, it instructs you in a straightforward way. Sut is, after all, a thread, right?
Yes.
And this particular structure of this novel, which is quite unusual for me, I should say, none of my other books has been in this straight line. And all of these 77 chapters are all lined up like a taut string. And I, in a way, set myself this problem. Write a novel that doesn't stray, that doesn't look right and left in the way that, for example, all my other books, but even the very first book, the Nama was, it's a sort of baggy structure. It allows you to toss in anything you like, recipes and paintings and all of that. You can look right, you can look left, and that part of the pleasure of writing that and possibly reading it is that you could do that. You're sort of in a train looking out of the windows. But in the sutra, in the form as I chose to present it, you don't look right, you don't look left. You go and then, and then, and then, and then, chapter 67, 68, 69, and it's all in a row.
Yes.
Now, the propaganda part, you know, you mentioned the academic. In fact, a great many people have seen this, the edicts as propaganda. And in fact, I agree that that is precisely what they are. But they are not necessarily political propaganda. They are social propaganda. Certainly, is out as a Buddhist to not possibly convert people, but to teach people Buddhistic morality. But he's also, as a king, he is performing a regal secular duty. He's teaching his citizens to respect one another. And both of these tasks are being carried on simultaneously. So I don't use propaganda, or I don't take propaganda, as you mentioned, Strong's use of it, in a pejorative sense. It is a positive.
So you feel that the sutras did contain Asoka's secularism?
As well as the religious.
Yes,
this is what I'm saying. It's a
yes.
two-pronged thing.
Wonderful, yeah. So the book also shows evidence of intense research, and you acknowledge the sutras, Ramila Thapar's book on Ashoka, Kautilya's Arthashastra, and numerous other books that you've mentioned. But most of these books deal with the exterior life of Asoka. So on what basis did you decide to pick his interior monologues, his dilemmas, his struggles, his challenges? Because that was more or less left to your imagination as a writer, because we don't have much information on that.
Certainly, yes. For example, we know nothing about his childhood. So all of those early chapters are pure fiction. But you're setting them up. You're setting up a character. You're building a character who can then proceed to be the man that is to come, about whom we do know something. So it's a kind of preparation. And even later, when you're mixing history with fiction, you're inclined to conjure up things that illustrate a facet. The Dhamma, for example, that is crucial, right? But a lot of it, a lot of the matter in those chapters is fictional. It's not padding. It's a kind of framing.
Yes. So if we look at the novel as a chronological structure, which it is, you're saying the earlier part of the novel contains much more of the fictional element, and as you go along.
No.
Based on character that you're...
Yes, in fact, the fiction comes all the way through, and at the very end, in fact, there's an equally large dose of it for the reader to swallow, and possibly in the middle, because the middle of his life is the part that we know best, because that's the part that's associated with the edicts, and that is where possibly fact preponderates. But even there, I'm not so sure.
So then how did you negotiate between these facts of history and the flights of fiction? Did you feel that the historical canvas limited you in any way? Or
not at all.
Did it free you in some way?
Well, I think it frees you because it's enabling in the sense that it provides a ground for you to stand on, right? You're not walking on air, but at the same time, you have carte blanche ahead of you. You can invent any character you please, or you can take minor figures from history. For example, the sculptor who actually, the man who inscribes the edicts, or the one person we know by name, is someone called Kapar. Now,
Yes.
Kapar is just a name, and it appears once in the whole history of Ashoka. But he becomes an important figure in this book, right? And the same thing happens with many others. And then also there are those who have no mention at all in history, but who have an important role to play.
Yes. Going from this character who was just one word that you found and whom you've embroidered and created and made him come alive, and there are other characters who are real and who are documented, like Sanghamitta, and they're pivotal to the Ashoka story.
Yeah.
Who were these characters who you felt obliged to create, and what was it that propelled you to create those characters over?
I'm not sure.
Why were they important?
I think Sanghamitta, as you mentioned, she is a crucial figure, and along with her brother Mahinda, and these are two names that go back much further back than my decision to write a book about Ashoka. And it always fascinated me that this king, who was such a great figurehead, he actually had a family. And the moment you start to think of a man with a family, he becomes human. And you start to look at him differently. And maybe that, so long ago, when I first read about Sanghamitta and Mahinda carrying the seed of Buddhism to Sri Lanka, from way back then, I possibly began to humanize this king. And certainly then there are scenes in this novel where, especially with Sanghamitta, who was very close. He is obviously his favorite child. She is his favorite child, this daughter. And even after she's gone, he says, I never saw my girl again. And he's shattered. He takes refuge in just touring the kingdom. And even when at the very end he's in exile, as it were, in this cave, she is still haunting him. She's still visiting him. Then there is the case of his wife, Devi, whom again we have a name from history. In fact, she was possibly even not his wife, but his mistress, his lover. At the time, he was a governor, a young man in Ujjaini. And there is an inscription in one of the caves where he says, I came here with my, and some people have said, unwedded consort to this cave. So there again, there's somebody out of history. But then I gave her a brother who is pure fiction, right? But he plays a crucial role. He becomes the Chancellor of the Exchequer and so on. And he's instrumental in rescuing Akbar's son, Kunala, of the eyes, later on in the book.
Yes.
So you can make use of history and real people, and then along come onto the page out of God knows where, they simply descend some sort of inspiration, and then that carries forward and you build on that.
Yes. So as a novelist, often you're invested more in one part of the novel than in others. So is there some episode in the book or some part of the book that you feel much more emotionally invested in or tied to?
Possibly, for me, the most emotional part was when Akbar parts with his wife, this woman Devi, whom I call Madhu in the book. Because at that point, his father has just died, and the colonel who is to play such a large role comes in and informs him of this. And then he says, I was walking in sand. Father was dead. And now he has to make a choice. And this choice involves his wife. And his wife is in many ways a stronger character than he is. And she says to him, no, you've made a decision that doesn't involve me. Yes, it's true that you're fitted to this role and you are the best man to be king. Go for it. But I will not accompany you. And this parting of ways was for me one of the most emotional parts of the book.
Yes, yeah, it was a touching, very strong moment. So Ashoka has been remembered as a thinker and a doer by history, but in your book he's refreshingly self-deprecatory. So was this also an effort to humanize him, as you mentioned before?
Certainly, yes. And in a way, what happens is that you start out to shadow this historical figure, but very soon, you're walking in his footsteps to start with, but very soon you enter him, you become him. So Ashoka is me, right? And I freely allow my thoughts into his head as freely as the traffic might be the other way around.
Absolutely.
And maybe that is what makes for this self-deprecatory nature that you speak of. Maybe that's a bit of me rubbing off. Maybe I'm just humanizing him, as you say. So all of these things are inevitable when you take a figure out of history and put him into this other crucible, which is a novel.
Yes. So another thing that I noticed in your book was that you've included a lot of anachronisms and anomalies, which sometimes take away from the verisimilitude. So what made you do this in a work of historical fiction? Because often what you're trying to do is put the reader completely into the story, but what I found was that these little moments sort of jarred you or made you a little surprised. So what was the intention behind that? I was a little fascinated to understand that.
Well, look, you have two readers. You have the common reader who wants to be totally involved in that illusion, right? And there's a part of the author as well who wants to create a pure illusion. Of course, it can't be done. You are reading a book. Everybody knows that they have to put the book down, they have to go somewhere, and they take it up. So this part, there is also an equal tradition on the modern side of the novel, which is aware of this and which exploits this by deliberately using the kind of anachronisms that you mentioned. For example, the reviewer for the Hindu, he scolded me for using the word desi, putting the word desi into the mouth of Prayagraj's brother.
Oh.
Sorry, Ashoka's brother, Prayagraj.
Yes.
What happens there is that they're in Takshila, and Ashoka is complaining. They're in his garret. Prayagraj has come upstairs to visit him, and he said, "What's the stink?" And he says, "It's just rubbish. These foreigners have learned of some of our tricks. You know, they just chuck their rubbish out of the window." And Prayagraj says, "They are not foreigners. We are on Desi soil." And of course, this reviewer took. To me, that's completely the wrong approach, right? The fun for a sophisticated reader, as opposed to the common reader that we talked about earlier, is that he is able to hold that illusion in his head and at the same time draw back from it. And this is the point of irony.
Yeah.
It's being able to hold 2 points of view in your head at one and the same time. And so then that Desi becomes a little bit of fun, a bit of a joke.
Yeah.
And this guy takes it seriously. I mean, idiot. What can you say? You'll have readers and readers.
Yes, so I think it did create that underlying humor, and you could see that,
I hope so.
It was a little bit of a joke between the reader and the author. Which,
yes, and there are a lot of nudges all the way through the book, a lot of winks and so on.
Yes,
and this will appeal to the other sort of reader. I hope it doesn't put off the first kind, but you have to please both sides.
Yes, absolutely. So you had already tackled another great king before. So what was it about these two leaders that attracted you to write about them? Was it something that you were trying to say about contemporary India? Why these choices? Because both of them have a secular streak, which was probably something that stood out in both characters. But what was it that propelled you to pick these two?
In the first place, because they are probably our greatest kings. I can't see anybody else, any other contenders who come close. And in terms of the sheer extent of their empire, but even if you don't call them great, which is a word that some people take exception to, they are outstanding kings. And they are possibly the only two kings from our history who have a worldwide reputation. Asoca, as you know, that famous passage by H.G. Wells, his name shines like a star alone in the whole of human history.
Yes.
Because here is a king who's not simply a conqueror and who then turns his back on conquest. And this was an important feature for Wells. With Akbar, of course, he lent his name to the Great Mughal. And this, everybody in the world knew of the Great Mughal. So these two figures, outstanding figures, they attracted me quite naturally, simply because of their sheer gravity, their presence. It's like the planet Jupiter, they're there. And then you have all the other little Mercuries and Marses and so on. But these two guys are there. And I was happy, not just happy, but I was almost compelled by that gravity, by the force of their personalities, if you like, to take them seriously enough to write about them. Now, it's very unlikely that I'm not actually terribly interested in historical fiction, and this is probably a one-off for me. But to take Akbar and Asoca side by side, I was fulfilling a kind of almost. I was addressing a personal puzzle. Which one of these is greater for me? Which one do I respect the more? And I have trouble answering that.
Okay. So you're not going to answer that question?
No, I have trouble answering that question of which of these two is the greater one.
I know. So if I ask the question, you would not answer it?
No, you please ask me that last bit again, the part which you say I have not answered.
Sorry, my question is, have you, at the end of writing these two novels, arrived at which one you prefer or which one you think is the greater leader?
No, but I think there is one who is relevant today, and that is Asoca, and specifically in his edicts, which have tremendous force and relevance today. Today we see a very different approach to politics. After all, here is a king who is advocating tolerance. And today, in contemporary India, we find the exact opposite. So if I could read out the epigraph that I've used for this book, that might answer your question.
These two, yeah.
And it says very simply, it's just 3 or 4 lines. And it's from the 12th rock edict. And remember, this is 250 BC. Here is an enlightened individual from thousands of years ago. And we should be ashamed that we have descended so far from this ideal. And what he says is, watch your tongue. Glorify your own faith, and you do it harm. Praise other faiths. Don't badmouth them.
Yes.
Mix with others. Learn from them. This way you honor your own faith and benefit every other. That's his 13th edict. Is that or is that not relevant today?
So is that the message for contemporary India that you were trying to present through both these books, particularly Asoca?
I would say I don't write books with messages. So any message that I present is actually it's something from the horse's mouth. It says, go and read the edicts.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for those wonderful answers, Mr. Sealy. We have questions now from a lot of people who want to talk to you. So we have a related question actually from someone called Arun G, who says, did you ever worry when writing this book about the potential for political reactions and book bans, etc.?
I don't think there's anything in this book that could invite a ban. It's not that I was careful. I wasn't censoring myself in any way. But the fact is that a lot of people who do make such objections, political objections to what I say novels or literary texts, they can come out of nowhere and use anything. Absolutely. They don't really need an excuse.
Yeah. Yes.
So I hope they don't find one, because I haven't swept them under the rug, but they're there. Please don't take offense. Gentlemen, not Arun, you gentlemen.
So another question from Vishwanath Kalbag, who says, how long did you research this, and did you immerse yourself in other accounts of the period in which the book is set?
Well, the research was, in fact, an immersion of all kinds of accounts of the period. The traditional, of course, the academic texts that we have from today, and I've mentioned, of course, Romila Thapa in the acknowledgements. And I gave my reasons for not mentioning anybody else, because it could then go into the hundreds. Yes. But among the classical texts, there are so many written by Buddhist monks and so many others. So I did, and of course the Arthashastra, of course, Kautilya's, yes. And Kautilya, in fact, is a character in this novel. He becomes, yes, Uncle K. Okay. Yes. So the Arthashastra is also a part of the backbone of this book. Mm-hmm. A lot, yes, of research. Yeah.
Yes, which is very apparent. So another question by Rita Rani, which actually I would have asked you if we had the time, but I'm glad she's asked, that you chose to make Asoca your Sutra-dhar. So at any point did you feel limited by this approach?
Yes, certainly. There are technical problems with any first-person narrative, mm-hmm, right? Yes. Obviously, this guy who's telling the story, he can't possibly die before the story ends, right? Yes. So how do you get around this? And how I got around it was simply that at the end, he hands the sutra over to somebody who has this phenomenal memory and who can hold that entire story in her head. And then she goes away, and it is through her that we are able to learn then the whole life of this first-person character.
Okay, lovely. So we have a question from V. Srinivasan, who says, why do we feel the need to demystify emperors and royalty as ordinary people? And what are we claiming in the process?
We're claiming that they're men or women. And I think the ordinary reader, who is very likely not an emperor or an empress, feels a certain empathy for a figure who has possibly even feet of clay, but who is human clay. We're so accustomed to the regal crown and the panoply and all of that. It is much easier to identify with an ordinary person. And in fact, every emperor or empress is that underneath the crown.
Here's a question from S. Vijay Lakshmi, who says, you've shared what you admired about Asoca, but can you tell us which qualities of each you most admire about Akbar and what should inspire us today?
Akbar, my goodness. People don't realize just little things. Akbar was a vegetarian, all right? This will take you by surprise, right? He was an absolute king with absolute power, and he knew how to exercise it. He knew, and he was ruthless at times, but that didn't make him a tyrant. And he had this other dimension to him, which rounded out his personality. He was illiterate, but he had an insatiable curiosity about the world. He was full of attempts to educate himself, and for this purpose he gathered scholars from all over the country at his court, and he would listen to their lectures and educate himself. And he had an interest in the other world beyond as well. So he's a multifaceted character, and I wish he were king today.
I think there's another question here by someone called Vrinda, who says, given Asoka's relationships with various women, do you think he was a feminist in some sense, that he sees them fully? Or is that you, Mr. Sealy?
That could possibly be me. I'm not a feminist. I love women. I love my wife. Yes, none of this. I think the fact that in many of my books, the stronger figure is a woman simply reflects my assessment of the world around me. And that doesn't make me a feminist. I don't set out to be one. I don't set out to curry favor. I just write what I see. I write what I feel. And all of these women had a great appeal to me. Even the villain of the piece, that young woman who becomes Ashoka's mistress in his dotage. She is a terrible character in history, you know, according to all the accounts. But I don't see her that way. And my portrait of her, I hope, is a sympathetic one.
Yes, I think all your female characters, I mean, this is obviously what Vrinda was talking about, because she did see the sympathetic portrayal, and that's why she probably asked the question.
I'm glad.
Yeah. So another question here by Anya Dhingra. Do you think the conversation around ahimsa can be brought alive again and help the world we find ourselves in today?
Certainly, and the conversation in modern times was conducted by Gandhi. And Gandhi is still a living figure for us. He is in every park, on every street, and all of that. There is an attempt to sideline him, a motivated attempt, but I think the power of his presence is such, and the force of his personality while he was alive was such, that he will win.
But you don't think he's been reduced to a token by present-day politicians?
certainly the attempt has been made, but look who's making the attempt.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question here from Varun Dama, who says, Asoca was not a paragon of virtue. What are some of Ashoka's negative qualities? After all, a novelist tries to create a rounded personality.
The story of his cruelty as a young man, I have made mention of it, and I've also made reference to the fact that he had a prison in Patliputra, which was popularly called Hell. Right? So Hell features in this book, and no king who has such a place is all good. So what I've tried to say is that certainly we must focus on what is good in this king, and for that matter in every person that we meet, but we should not be blind to the fact that they have this other side, and we should not at the same time allow that to interfere with our vision of what is right and good.
Yeah, but at some point he's actually denying the rumors about him having killed those women, right? So
he denies the rumors that he killed 99 of his brothers, right? So that's another joke. Who has 99 brothers? Only somebody in fiction, only someone in a myth. So obviously it's not true. And he had 500 wives. Well, again, he laughs at that.
I'm back. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, so we have maybe one last question from Arya Kolwalkar, who says, are you considering writing about women historical figures?
No, as I said earlier, I think I answered this question before when Rashmi was speaking, that I don't really have a great interest in historical fiction. And even this book is not a standard historical work, at least a standard historical novel. So in front of me, I can see 3 or 4 books, and none of them is set in history. They're all set in the present.
So are you thinking of writing a non-standard book on a historical fiction on a woman?
Well, I'll tell you, no. In fact, my next book is a kind of gazetteer, and it's set here, right here in the Doon Valley. It is a kind of non-fiction fiction. And so all the people who live here or ever lived here, including one famous Rani, they will populate that book, and in ways that are strange to tell.
Lovely. Okay, so maybe last question from Komal Mistry, who says, your books have an epic quality to them, so it must be a very immersive process. How do you feel when you're done writing?
Oh my God, you feel relieved. Because you're tired. My first book I was researching for 7 years, right? And I had no job as such, no proper job. But there's a certain force, a certain momentum that keeps you going, and that is extremely tiring. But you're living on willpower. And when you put in the last full stop, the last dot, then the sort of pen falls from your hand, and you go, oof.
Yeah. So, did you find yourself transformed by the writing of the book in any way?
Possibly. I think I learned not just about Ashoka, a great deal, but I learned about the tradition out of which he comes. And so in that sense, certainly I didn't undergo anything like a transformation. I hadn't killed 100,000 people, so I didn't have his sorrows or his conscience. But the transformation that occurred in me, I suppose, had more to do with his tradition, and therefore more with his master than with this man, the Buddha himself.
Okay, I think we're out of time right now. So I will hand this over back to Ratnabali. Ratnabali, are you ready? Yes? Okay, thanks so much, Mr. Sealy.
Very welcome.
Oh, thank you for the delightful conversation. And I was a king in today's times. We would all breathe a little easier. A big thank you to you, Mr. Irwin Sealy and Ms. Palkhivala, and a big thanks to the partners who have made this possible. Tata Literature Live, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej, continues with many more sessions. Do check out the website, and if you want to spend some time in a virtual bookshop, head on to landmarkexcite.com, our knowledge partner, where you can grab hold of Irwin Sealy's books. With that, I'll be signing off now. See you at the next session.